realtors for 11 years. Now he's, at the county level, and so we're going to get focused on what's happening in LA County. It's going to be a little more of a micro look at what's happening in LA County, which is nice because usually we get more of a broad California view of what's happening. I guess he had got his degrees over at that university near the center of town. I forgot. But we accept all kinds here. And we're very happy to have him because we've had him before. He's got a great sense of humor. I think we're going to take some questions at the end. Jack will be handling that. So without further ado, I think we'll have Robert come up here and talk to us about LA County real estate.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you doing today?
Good morning.
Geez, I don't know. It has been quite a number of years that I've been coming here to South Bay. More recently, as the year ends, to kind of give a wrap up on what's been happening in the housing market, and then take a look ahead as to what we expect to see happening in the housing market, as well as the economy. Let me just tell you before I get started about the LAEDC, the place I work for now. I was with the California Association of Realtors, as you know, for 11 years. And the LAEDC is actually a 501c3 nonprofit, so I'm not even a county employee with this one. Anyway, so we have several roles. One is to do economic research, sort of like a think tank, and that's the part that I head up. We also have a public policy group that tries to take the lead on issues that relate to the business climate here in LA County and all of California. Let's see, what else? Labor market issues, any number of things that require a local county level sort of perspective. Then we have a business assistance team that we have a group of people who actually go to businesses that have maybe workforce needs, or maybe they're thinking about relocating, and for free our organization helps them to connect with the right people and the right resources to make that happen. So it's been a cool move. I moved at the beginning of last year from CAR. Had a great time working with and for the realtors throughout the state of California, and it's so nice to see many familiar faces here this morning. And now I'm on to this, which has been a lot of fun as well. Do you remember Jack Kaiser? Anybody remember Jack Kaiser? So I get to be the new Jack Kaiser, which is about as cool as it can be for an economist in Southern California. It's like a kid in a candy store. So this is an auspicious day, 12/12/12. Yeah. And hopefully we'll make it through 12/21/12, right? That's the day that the world will end. So you've got between now and then to act on all the information that I'm about to give you today. I'm going to talk about the U.S. economy, then we'll take a look at the California economy, drill down to what's happening in LA, with a look at the housing market, both statewide and in Los Angeles County. Then we'll wrap up with a forecast and conclusion. This is I feel like I should be right down there with you, but given the arrangement here, I will act like I'm doing this formally. But if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll see if I can handle it on the fly, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So first question to you. Do you think the recession is over? How many of you think the recession is over? Show of hands. Okay, not bad for a realtor group. I've been asking this question pretty much all year long, and I get only a handful of hands that show when I ask this question in the affirmative. And so you have to ask, well, why is this? When you take a look at the basic information that economists use to determine the health of the economy, it appears, at least at first glance, as though we've recovered. First off, the first basic vital sign of the economy is gross domestic product. I consider it to be the heartbeat of the economy. And so over on the right side, you can see in red where the Great Recession hit, a 3.1% decline in GDP that happened back in 2009. that was really the worst, at least in terms of this metric, the worst of the recession that we experienced. Doesn't come anywhere close to the Great Depression, by the way. So this is the Great Recession, the worst we've experienced in our working lifetimes, the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. But instead of a 3% decline in GDP during the Great Depression, it was more like a 50% decline in GDP. So let's just thank our lucky stars that it was not worse. But it doesn't feel like we've come back yet. We've got growth. The last couple of years, those blue bars on the right-hand side show that we've grown. But here's the problem. If you look across and you see all the red bars, and then you look at the next couple of blue bars that follow, they generally represent growth in excess of 3%. 3% is the long-run normal, okay, for GDP growth in the United States. Typically, after recessions, we come back strong and we grow faster than normal, faster than 3%. That hasn't happened this time around. So that's one of the reasons why the unemployment rate continues to languish at a high level, much higher than we ought to see 3.5 years out from the technical end of the recession. So we got as high as 10% right now. As you can see in the headline, we're at 7.7%. The long-run normal unemployment rate for the U.S. is probably closer to 6%. By this time, in the post-recession period, we should have already gotten back to normal, and we should really be firing on all cylinders. So the issue here is that our economy is growing at a slower pace than we need in order to bring this unemployment rate down in a reasonable amount of time. And that reasonable amount of time, of course, has already passed. It should have come down within about 2 years in the aftermath of the recession. So the fact that we're 3.5 years out, almost double that normal recovery time, weighs heavily on those of us who recognize that, geez, things aren't quite right. So here's what's been going on recently. And I talk about the labor market because it's like the pulse on the economy. Every month we get a read on what's happening. And you'll hear these numbers. You'll usually hear in the news the unemployment rate, 7.7%. You're also going to hear about non-farm jobs, so the number of wage and salary jobs that have been created over the past month. And this figure shows that non-farm job number, which last month was 146,000. That sounds like a good number. It sounds like, geez, we ought to be bringing the unemployment rate down with that kind of labor market growth. Well, the fact of the matter is that every month we add to our labor force. People come into the labor force after they complete their education or for whatever reason, to the tune of 120,000 to 130,000 people. So the job creation that we need minimally just to absorb those people coming into the workforce is 120 to 130,000 a month. And last month we had 146,000. So we only created net maybe 16,000 new jobs to help bring the unemployment rate down. That's the challenge. Coming out of past recessions, we've typically seen growth at about double the rate. Instead of 146, we'll say roughly 150,000 jobs per month. It's been more like 300,000 per month. So we'll take the gains that we have gotten over these last few months and over the past few years. This shows down here in the bottom right-hand side that we recovered a little bit more than half of the jobs that were lost during the recession. But again, the reason that we're not seeing that unemployment rate come down so quickly as we would like has to do with the slow pace of recovery in the economy. Let me pull this up quickly. And oops, back up for a second. There. And I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but you hear about this stuff all the time. You might as well kind of understand how it all fits together. Not only, so this graph starts at the beginning of the recession, the first month of recession, and each one of those lines corresponds to a different recession since the 1970s. So here are a couple things to note. I'm going to step away from the mic. Okay. So we lose jobs as the recession ensues, right? Okay. At each one of these boxes, that represents the end of that particular recession. So the recovery starts at that point. This is the cycle that we're going through right now. So the first thing you note is, gee whiz, we lost a whole lot more jobs. Okay. Second thing you note is that even after we passed through the technical end of the recession, we continued to lose jobs. And then the third thing to note is that as we're recovering, the recovery is at such a slight pace, it doesn't come anywhere close to the much steeper recoveries that we've seen in the past. So that's sort of the decomposing what's been happening in the economy. And so putting all this stuff together, in essence, we needed to see the economy grow, GDP growth, somewhere around 3.5% to 4% in order to generate the labor market growth closer to 3% that would bring that unemployment rate down in a reasonable amount of time. Looks like we're stuck at a 2% growth rate. We've experienced that or somewhere close to that last year. We expect it to happen this year. And then depending on what happens with the fiscal cliff, we expect about a 2% growth rate next year. So some economists say that this is the new normal. You've probably heard that expression used. I think the question is whether or not new normal is something that applies to the next couple of years or the next dozen years. And my feeling is that it's probably that over the next couple of years. I don't see any sort of breakout growth that's going to kick us up to a higher growth trajectory. But over the long term, I think we can at least identify some signs that are going to help us to expect 3 or 4% growth going forward. This just aligns the two. So it basically shows that unless we get GDP growth higher than the green line, we don't get that black line, which is labor market growth, that goes fast enough to bring the unemployment rate down. Over on the far right-hand side, you can see where we are. Both of those lines fall short of that green line. Okay? Right, so 3 vital signs: GDP, labor market, and third is the rate of inflation, the blood pressure, if you will, of the economy. And that has been very tame. So thankfully, despite things like gasoline price spikes that we experience every now and then, the overall rate of inflation is generally held steady. You can see that it's at 2.2%. The blue line represents the overall rate of inflation. The red line represents the rate of inflation that you get after you take out the 2 most volatile components of the things that we buy, and that's energy and food. And you say, well, geez, you know, I eat food every day, and I drive my car every day, so aren't you taking out a couple of pretty important things? Well, the two together probably add up to maybe 20 or 25% of our total market basket of expenditures. So the other 80% or so really doesn't experience huge price swings. So it's worth noting that. You know, we buy a lot of services, and the prices of services don't typically go up, or they don't fluctuate a whole lot through time. And so you get a lot of price stability overall from that. Does that make sense? So we've got an economy that's growing. It's growing at a pace that helps to bring the unemployment rate down, but at an uncomfortably slow rate. And that's kind of why we don't feel as though the recession's over. We just don't have normal conditions yet. And then you, of course, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but you, of course, are dealing with consumers every day, and consumers, for a number of reasons, feel hesitant about the current situation and about the outlook. So now you've been hearing ad nauseum all about the fiscal cliff, right? And you wonder, well, why is it that I've got this imagery here? So I'm driving home from downtown LA one afternoon, thinking about the fiscal cliff. This is what economists do. Okay? We think about the fiscal cliff when we're stuck in traffic. And I'm looking over at the right-hand side mirror, and I see, you know, objects may be closer than they appear. And I have just, for the last few months, I've been talking about the fiscal cliff, and specifically talking about how some businesses have already had to respond to the uncertainty that is brought on by that fiscal cliff. So even though everybody's talking about January being the magic date, the fact of the matter is, at least some business activity has cooled. Some hiring has been delayed, if not canceled outright. Some contracts have not moved forward, in part because this fiscal cliff looms. Now it's just a couple weeks away, but during the summertime when I put this together, it was still a few months away, but it was closer in the sense that some people were already having to respond to this eventuality. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you've heard quite a bit about it in the news. And so the basic idea here is that these are policy decisions that have the potential to tip us into a recession. Taking one step back from that, let me just remind you that the reason we are in this situation in the first place is that the federal government Congress and the administration wants to get our fiscal house in order. So we have budget deficits that really became quite large over these last few years, partly because of the recession. We also routinely, and of course you all know, we routinely have deficits. So it's not that we've suddenly got a deficit, but it's a much bigger deficit than we have had historically. And then the second thing is that our federal debt continues to climb, because if we have a deficit, we have to borrow money to pay for it. So in an effort to begin to address those long-term problems, which is indeed something that we need to do, this fiscal cliff has come along by virtue of a few policy decisions. The first part consists of a bunch of tax cuts that are scheduled to go away. The essence of this is that if your taxes go up, let's say your income tax goes up, income tax rate goes up because of an end of the Bush era tax cuts, that leaves you with less money in your pocket to spend, so you're going to spend less. Consumer spending in the economy will contract. That's inherently recessionary. There's a payroll tax cut that you may not know about because you're independent contractors for the most part, but if you were a wage and salary worker, you would have benefited from a 2% cut in your payroll tax withholding for the last couple of years. It was a direct response to the recession. Unemployment benefits had been extended year after year after year. Those extensions are scheduled to go away. There were some depreciation allowances for business that were also in place to help them during the course of the recession, also scheduled to go away. The sum total of all this, if it all happens, that is to say, if these cuts expire and those rates go up, would be to create a drag on the economy that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 to 1.8%. So we're talking about a pretty significant drag just by virtue of those things on the top. Okay? And then down below, you've got some expenditure cuts under the fancy word sequestration. About $55 billion in cuts for next year on the defense side, about $55 billion on the non-defense side. And if that should happen in its full force, that would reduce GDP by about 1/2 to a little bit more than 1/2%. So the sum total of these things represents a drag on the economy of somewhere between 2.5% and 2.8%. Okay? Well, if we expect 2% growth and we have a drag on the economy, let's say of 2.5%. Let's see, I'm an economist, so math isn't so good, but 2 minus 2.5 leaves me with a negative number, which is a recession. Okay? So that's the problem. The timing of all this is very fungible. The Congress and the administration, should we actually go over the cliff in its full force, the timing is something they can work with to kind of soften the blow. But the fact of the matter is, in an overall sense, these policy measures, which are avoidable, have the potential to tip us back into recession when only a handful of us even think that we've gotten out of the last recession. So we're in a fragile recovery state. The last thing we need right now is to enact policies that will do damage to the economy. So admittedly, we do need to address these long-term issues. It's just that, I don't have it here. It's just that this isn't quite the right way to do it. Let me just give you a couple more details, and then I'm going to move on to talk about the rest of the story here. But just for reference, because you're going to hear so much in the news, okay? A lot of times when we take a look at the budget deficit for the U.S. government, we characterize it relative to GDP. And right now, the government outlays, government expenditures on all types of programs, including entitlements, add up to about the equivalent of 23 or 24% of GDP. Our outlays right now, our receipts right now add up to about 15%. So we've got 23% of outlays minus 15% of receipts. So our deficit is about 7% of GDP. Okay. Normally, the outlays are 20%. That's a long-term 50-year history. 20%. The receipts are 18%. The gap is 2%. So we're looking at a gap that's about 3 times the long-term normal. We'll always, in all likelihood, we'll always be dancing around having a budget deficit. So eliminating the deficit altogether isn't necessarily the objective, but bringing it down to some sort of a long-term normal rate that is sustainable, that lends credibility to our government's ability to manage its finances. That's really the objective. And if we can do that, then we can also rein in our federal budget, our federal debt. Okay? There's so much more to talk about on that. I know I spent a lot more time than you were probably expecting, but it's the hot news item. And I'll be honest with you, you'll see when I get into some of the industry stuff that we're looking at potential impacts on the aerospace industry. Well, okay, here we are in the South Bay. You've got tons of aerospace workers, okay? The defense cuts alone could jeopardize at least a few, if not more than a few, jobs in the aerospace sector. We already know that it's going through yet another restructuring. You probably heard a few weeks ago about Boeing Space and Systems Division, that they're restructuring. They're going to be getting rid of some top-level management out here. I think they're looking at maybe like a 30% cut in staffing. These are the kinds of people who are buying homes in the beach cities. They're buying the high-end homes and the moderately priced middle-level homes. And so the fiscal cliff can have a very real impact on their well-being and in turn on the well-being of the housing market. So this isn't just some sort of distant thing that is happening in Washington, D.C. That may or may not affect our local communities here. It has the potential to have a very real impact. Just one more thing about that. LA County, over the past 10 years, has been the largest recipient of government defense contracts of any county in the state of California, and probably of any county in the nation. Only last year, San Diego overtook LA County as the largest county recipient of defense contracts. Those of us who were analyzing the economy, or working in real estate, or working anywhere back in the 80s and 90s will remember how big the aerospace industry was and how it shrunk from almost over 200,000 people back in the late 1980s to about 70,000 people today. Okay? So we're looking at yet another restructuring that's going to whittle away at that 70,000 remaining jobs, and it's really a very important sector of the economy. So we've got these things that are creating hesitation among consumers and businesses. Consumers still haven't seen their homes recover in value. Maybe they've seen their the financial part of their portfolio come back, recover in value, maybe even register some gains. They're still having difficulty getting access to credit. There are a lot of things holding consumers back, along with the fact that the general economy, as represented by the unemployment rate and consumer confidence, those are indicators that tell us that the consumer sector is still quite hesitant. Businesses are really waiting for consumers to step forward and spend more. They're ready to produce. They cut deeply during the recession. They're profitable. The corporate America is sitting on a lot of cash. So all they need is a green light, and the green light has to come from consumers. We already talked about, excuse me, about the government and the situation it finds itself in. So we've got economic policy. The government part of the economy really can't be expected to step forward and push this economy to a faster rate of growth. And the rest of the world, we don't have any or very little control over that. So that's kind of out of the question. At least we know who's going to be the president next year. So that's actually eliminated some uncertainty. When you put all this together and you look at the major parts of the economy, consumers, business, government, the rest of the world, it's the consumer sector that really has to pull us forward, beginning in 2013 and proceeding forward. So as the consumer sector heals, we'll start to see GDP growth pick up and the rest of the economy will follow. So that's why we're paying close attention to personal consumption. Here we are in the holiday season. We're looking at retail sales. Happy to see that they continue to grow. Everybody's expected that they would grow at a modest single-digit rate. That seems to be what we're getting. So if nothing else, we're not getting any adverse surprises, right? So there's a lot of momentum in the private economy that is going to carry us forward. And hopefully the policy decisions in Washington, D.C. will not derail that momentum. That's pretty much the situation that we see for the nation. Now let's take a minute and talk about California. First off, California, as you know, is tied closely to the rest of the country. So, excuse me, we need growth nationally in order to sustain growth here in California. We also need growth around the world. We're, generally speaking, one of the 2 or 3 largest states when it comes to exports to the rest of the world. And so as the rest of the world performs, so performs the state of California. We definitely turned the corner in 2012. We had an unemployment rate, if you look back in sort of the middle of the diagram, we had an unemployment rate during the worst of the recession that was around 12.5%. As of October, that unemployment rate had fallen to 10.1%. We basically made up, or we erased 1% of that unemployment rate over the course of 1 year from October of 2011 to October 2012. That's really significant progress. How did we do that? Those orange lines show year-over-year job growth in the California labor market. And you can see on the right-hand side, the growth was around, if not exceeding, 2%. Now, the nation had been adding jobs this year at a 1.4% growth rate. California has been exceeding that, has been outpacing the national labor market with a 2% growth rate. That's enabled us to bring this unemployment rate down a lot faster than had been the case the last couple of years. We're really pleased to finally see that the state economy has improved momentum. And the question is whether or not we're going to hang on to that momentum going into 2013. Good or bad, a lot of that momentum came initially from and continues to come from the Bay Area. You've got San Jose and San Francisco here with 3.5% year-over-year growth rates in their labor markets. You look down a little further, about 2/3 of the way down, excuse me, and LA County has been growing around 1.5% to 2%, with the most recent reading here at 1.5%. So we're glad to see that. LA really lagged in recovery over these last few years. You can see up at the top, we're making progress. We added almost 300,000 jobs on a year-over-year basis in the state of California. So it's good news to be able to report that the statewide labor market and the statewide economy is on the mend. We still have fiscal problems, there's no doubt about it, even with the passage of Prop 30. Although if you've listened to the news recently, you'll hear that the Legislative Analyst's Office has said that we're much better positioned fiscally in the state of California as a result of the passage of Prop 30 to not just whittle away significantly at the deficits we've had, but also to perhaps turn a surplus in the span of 2 or 3 years. That'll help us a whole lot to just have one less thing to worry about. Then the guys up in Sacramento, not only do we have to worry about their indecision, but we have to worry about them managing money. If they can at least go from being in the red to being in the black, at least all we have to worry about is their indecision. Or you don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, I know you guys are wanting me to talk about the housing markets. So. All right, so let's talk about the housing market for a few minutes. Again, I feel it's important for me to talk about these numbers in the context of the stories that you hear in the news or that your clients hear in the news. So one of the things that I hear from a lot of commentators these days is that the level of home sales hasn't quite come back to where it should be. I don't buy that for the state of California. This graph shows CAR's home sales series. It's a monthly series on a seasonally adjusted annualized basis. Unfortunately, it's a little bit cut off. Those are interesting dates, too. Somehow that got transformed. This goes back, should be to 2007. So this is January 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm not sure what happened with the scale down there. What it doesn't show is the boom years. During the boom years, we had sales that were 600,000 plus, okay? If you take a look at about a 20-year history of sales in the state of California, that average is somewhere around 500,000, maybe a little bit less. If you take a look at the number of housing units, turnover rate, things like that, the state of California should experience home sales on average ranging, I know it's a broad range, but nevertheless, somewhere between, say, the high 400,000s to the mid 500,000s. Well, we've been in that range these last couple of years. The right side shows the last couple of years of home sales, and 2011 was a tough year. So that's right here, 2010. But we've really been at or above a 500,000 threshold for the better part of this year. So home sales, I think, are just fine. In fact, they would be even stronger if we had more supply, correct? And everybody was looking for some transition, not a transition point, but a concrete sign that home prices had firmed up and were finally heading north. I think we finally got that this year with the trend in home prices. So here you've got the statewide median shown in black. It was $341,370. Just for the record, home prices, or the median home price in California, actually bottomed out over 3 years ago. $245,000, so we're now about $100,000 above that low. Of course, we're a far cry from the peak that we had back in 2007. Yes?
The scale is correct on the handouts.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. All right, so you should be able on the handouts to get the dating here. So my point here in talking about the California market is that home prices, this was the transition year for the California housing market, where home prices stabilized and, of course, began to rise. You know that the median price is a little bit distorted because of the mix of sales. So this year we saw a pretty significant shift away from distressed properties that also tended to be low-end toward more high-end properties. And by virtue of that shift in comparison to the prior year, the year-over-year percent change, 10.2%, looks great on paper. Probably didn't happen to every house that sold in 2012 that's in this set of statistics. I'm sorry, 23% year-over-year price gain. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about in terms of the change in the mix of sales. If you go again, the scale here is a little bit odd. Let's see where it begins. I believe it begins in 2008. 2009. Okay. So back in 2009, the red line shows that 60% of sales in the California housing market were REO. Shift all the way to the far right-hand side, and as of October of 2012, it's just 12%. Huge change in the market. Short sales were essentially non-existent during the worst of the recession and the hardest months and years of the housing market, with under 10% back in 2009. It's more than doubled since then. It certainly is now it's certainly a much more viable and attractive way to go than a foreclosure for just about every party that's involved. So that's showing up in the market stats. And then, of course, the non-distressed sales appear there in blue at a low of 30% back in 2009, now more than double at over 60%. So indeed, the market has changed quite a bit in terms of the mix of sales. That's going to continue in 2013. REOs are going to become, probably their share is going to fall under 10%. Short sales are still going to be around. You're still going to hear stories about the California housing market and the number of people who are underwater, and all of this doomsday story about the shadow inventory. We can address that in just a couple of minutes. So it's not like we're out of the woods by any means. And if you consider or ask the question, well, when is it that the median price is going to get back to where it was during the peak? Jeez. How many years out can I count? It's probably going to happen faster than we expect, but I think it would be late in this decade before we would see the median price in the state return to, I think it was $570,000 or thereabouts. We're a ways away from that. Shouldn't even be in our sights, quite frankly. Let's just rack up some steady price appreciation and look for signs that the market is closer to a normal state of affairs. It's not normal right now with the constraints on supply, as you know. So, spending a little bit more time on the distressed property situation and on the shadow inventory story. Let me just talk about that. Here you've got foreclosure radar's numbers on the number of REO properties in inventory. Excuse me. That appears in red. 64,000 properties as of October. That's for the state as a whole. And that's both, single family and multifamily. So, but nevertheless, 60,000 in a housing market that turns 500,000 plus annually of existing home sales, of single family existing home sales. Add another 20% to that for condo activity. You've got a market in size that's large enough to digest 64,000 REO properties in a reasonable amount of time. That's where we are right now. So don't let the stories about shadow inventory scare your would-be buyers and sellers off, or your would-be buyers off, excuse me. Those shadow inventory numbers get really big when you start adding everything into it. And if we just start with this and work backwards, we're going to probably have a pretty good idea of what things are going to look like a year or even a year and a half from now. So the red line represents REOs in inventory held by the banks right now. The green line represents properties that are in pre-foreclosure state, so those are delinquent or a notice of default has been submitted. So there were 73,000 of those in October. So that's the front end of the foreclosure pipeline, the red line being the back end. How long does it take to work through the foreclosure process these days? Any idea? Some of them it's taken years. I think the average is like 18 months.
Yeah.
Right. So the green line, 73,000, is what we'll see in the red line 18 months from now. So in the middle of 2014. Okay. Won't be entirely eradicated, but with a housing market that's putting up the levels of sales that I think we are capable of, it's going to be less and less of a problem. Yes.
Those bulk sales that they're selling blocks of massive, amounts of homes, is that factored into that at all?
This is just the count. So these aren't the outcomes when they're sold. These are the properties that go into the bank inventory. Then the next step, so moving from that 64,000, you'd have to look at how many the bank sold in bulk, how many were sold to individual sellers, and so on. As far as the shadow inventory is concerned, I don't have a slide, but usually what happens is the analysts take a look at the number of properties that are underwater. And so right now, I think 30% of homeowners with a mortgage are underwater. If you were to assume that all of those people are going to eventually go into foreclosure, then you end up with a pretty big number. But quite frankly, as the economy improves, fewer and fewer of those people who are underwater are likely to go into foreclosure. Some people actually like the homes they live in. They didn't just buy them for financial reasons. So even if they're underwater, they're probably still going to hang on to them for a while, if not longer than that. So that's one thing. So the stories about the massive numbers of people who are underwater and in turn will eventually default, it's a red herring. It's taken our eye off the ball, and they're throwing too many things into that bucket really for it to be a meaningful number. Okay, the other part of, hang on one second, yes?
Back to that last slide. What happens then if the home mortgage interest deduction is reduced or eliminated with those people that are currently underwater?
So that's a great question. Most people are just looking at how it is likely to affect the housing market as a whole. Excuse me. And let me start off with that perspective, and then we'll talk about those people. So the first observation about the mortgage interest deduction is that it tends to benefit people on the two coasts. Okay, if you live in the middle of the country and you've got a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home on a 2-acre lot that you bought for $80,000, and those do exist, you might have to deal with the weather, but that's a separate issue. But for you, the mortgage interest deduction doesn't really help. The standard deduction oftentimes is big enough so that it covers all of the deductions that you would likely be in a position to pay. So we're talking about a mortgage interest deduction that largely benefits the people on the coast that have high-valued homes. Of course, if you go to Barstow, you'd also find homes with all due due respect to the people who live there, that are priced at like $60,000. So the mortgage interest deduction probably doesn't help those people either, right? So reducing the mortgage interest deduction is specifically going to, first of all, it's unlikely to be eliminated, right? That seems to be the consensus. It's maybe not the third rail like Social Security or Prop 13 here in California, but it's pretty close. So they're probably not going to eliminate the mortgage interest deduction entirely. They're probably going to put a cap on it, or there's a possibility that they're going to put a cap on all types of deductions. So that's a little bit different wrinkle. So what does this do? It essentially takes away some part of a subsidy to home ownership. It's going to make the cost of home ownership a little bit higher. In the scheme of things, at the margin, it could tip the balance for some homeowners who are underwater away from hanging in there and maybe selling or going into foreclosure, so maybe pursuing a short sale where they otherwise would not. But I really think at the margin that's not likely to make a huge difference. And it would be a slow playing story. But I do think that the mortgage interest deduction, the cuts that they're anticipating in the interest, the limitations, maybe cutting from $1 million to $500,000, that can put a dent in some tiers of the market. That's the more likely outcome. It's not going to affect necessarily the market as a whole, although there could be, you could argue that there might be a ripple effect through other price tiers. If it affects the higher end of the market, it might create a ripple effect through other price tiers, but I think that ripple effect would be quite muted. Jim, did you have a question?
Well, I had a comment. The fact that interest rates have fallen so low makes the interest deduction has a lot less impact.
Yeah.
10% interest, 3% interest, it's going to be a third of the impact.
Yeah. And I don't have a mortgage interest rate slide, and you might think that's odd, but I mean, rates have been low, continue to be low, have been low, I mean, are expected to be low going forward. So that's a good thing, it's a bad thing. It eliminates a source of urgency on the part of would-be buyers to buy before rates go any higher. And I wish I could say, you know, you should be encouraging your buyers to get off the fence and buy while the buying is good because mortgage rates are going to go up. I don't see mortgage rates going up anytime soon. Once the economy kicks into a higher gear, then you're going to see mortgage rates go up despite the efforts on the part of the Fed to keep long rates low. But that just isn't in the cards given what we see in terms of the growth of the economy with or without the fiscal cliff. Okay. Back to the California housing market, this shows housing permits for the state. Really took a hit during the recession, fell to a low of 36,000 odd units. The long run normal is about 150,000. So this part of the California economy was decimated during the recession. And you can see it's a long ways away from coming back. Even by next year, we don't even anticipate crossing the 100,000 threshold, much less getting to 150,000. Later on in the decade, I think the tide will turn. We're reading now about households or members of households that are finally moving out. If they're maybe an older child who had moved in during the recession to their parents' home, moving out, so that's the creation of a new household. There's going to be an increase in the demand for rental properties. Maybe some households, for one reason or another, or friends doubled up for a few years. That, you know, with income growth, you're going to find creation of new households. It's first going to be, excuse me, felt in the rental market. I think it already has, and then it's going to work its way into the ownership market. Okay, so what we see for the California economy is slow and steady growth, but even next year, you can see in the second line there, we're still looking at double-digit unemployment rates. That's an annual average for 2013, 10% even. So probably by this time next year, we'll be below 10%, but we'll probably still be around 9.5%. And the magic number for the state of California is probably 7.5%. So even by the end of next year, we'll still have a lot of room for improvement in the labor market. Okay. So all in all, we've got, just to kind of recap where we've been so far, the U.S. economy is growing, but at an uncomfortably slow pace. The fiscal cliff has the potential to derail that fragile recovery, so let's hope we do not go over it. The California economy this year and probably next year will grow at a little bit faster pace than the national economy. That's good because we have a deeper hole to dig out of. Our unemployment rate at 10.2% is quite a bit higher than the 7.7 for the nation as a whole. But we're headed in the right direction, and if you've survived in the housing market these last few years, then you're certainly going to feel like next year is going to look good. Now let's talk about LA. It's always a good idea for us to remind ourselves how big this place is. So with 10 million people, we're bigger than 43 states. You start adding in adjacent counties, you get 18 million people, almost half of the entire population for the state of California. I don't have it with me, but our GDP, just for LA County alone, makes us the 21st largest economy in the world. So if something it's one of the reasons why if something happens here, it seems to catch the attention of people all over the place. LA's unemployment rate continues to be at double digits. It's the black line that appears here. So it was 10.2%, same as the state unemployment rate for the month of October. We'll be getting an update for November on Friday from the California EDD. So if you take a look, we've seen some pretty good improvement over the past year. Those unemployment rates, for the most part, have fallen by somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% or more. So that certainly is welcome, but we still have so much farther to go. LA's unemployment rate, long run, is probably very close to the state unemployment, long run unemployment rate of 7.5%. So if we're just about a little bit above 10 right now, we still need to work away at 2.5 percentage points, yes.
What percentage of that is, say, manufacturing compared to, say, construction? Where obviously in Southern California, construction is a huge part of that. I guess is there a way to determine construction versus manufacturing? Obviously,
yeah, I don't have the exact numbers for construction for LA, but I know that for the state as a whole, we had over 900,000 workers in construction. These are wage and salary workers, that doesn't even include the independent contractors, day laborers, subcontractors who are 1099s, but just the wage and salary workers in the construction sector numbered over 900,000 before the recession. It fell to like 670,000 or something like that. So we lost well over a couple 100,000, closer to 300,000 jobs, wage and salary jobs in that sector. And right now we're back over 700,000. So that's good, but that recovery has been quite slow. The recovery has not been occurring in housing. It's been occurring with institutional construction, building buildings for school systems and healthcare facilities. We see a lot of road construction taking place around the state of California. Also, that's where the construction jobs are showing up. It's going to be a few years, but we'll eventually see a pickup in residential construction employment as well.
Thank you.
Sure. So non-farm jobs in LA, we're glad to report, have shown upward momentum. At the beginning of the year, that little green bar shows where we were in January. We were growing at a little bit less than 1/2 of 1%. More recently, it's been more in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2% year over year. So we're actually growing faster than the nation, so that's good. Here you can see what's been happening with the individual sectors of the economy, so specifically construction. Grew at 1% on a year-over-year basis. These other sectors, educational services, grew through the recession. This is private education, so these are jobs at USC, Loyola Marymount, places like that, as well as K through 12 private education institution jobs. Administrative support and wage services, those gains are mainly in temporary employment. Leisure and hospitality, retail, trade tend to be where you find entry-level jobs. Those continue to grow. Financial activities, which would include the finance component of real estate and the real estate wage and salary jobs, like property management jobs and so on, those are registering gains. So we're seeing the real estate sector, as it's represented by wage and salary employment, improve in 2012 in a manner that we just didn't see for quite a number of years. So the laggards down at the bottom are government and manufacturing. We've been losing jobs here in manufacturing in LA County. Pretty much, there was a big drop off during the recession, and then we continue to lose jobs with a few exceptions. So a lot of people say, or commentators in the news say, that the jobs that we're creating are mostly entry-level minimum wage jobs. And in this table confronts that myth. So not all jobs are McJobs. Here's the average annual wage for someone working as a wage and salary employee in LA County. Okay, that's the average, not the median. These sectors have below average wages, as you can see. The blue represent above average wages. And if, this was for July, but if you add up the number of jobs created in yellow, and then you add up the number of jobs created in blue, even net of those two red numbers, it turns out that we've added more jobs in the higher paying sectors than in the lower paying sectors. So this is a much more balanced recovery. We're not just adding entry-level minimum wage jobs. We're adding jobs across an entire spectrum. It includes, professional jobs, as well as jobs in restaurants and so on. Okay. So my job is to track what's happening around LA County, the individual industries. These are the main industries in LA County, as I'm sure you know. Those at the very top there are the industries where we really benefit as a local economy, because movies get made here, but then the tickets are sold all over around the world, and then we get the proceeds from that. So that's our main export. Okay? Trade with all the port activity, that's also a key export for our region, where those things generate revenues that come in from other parts of the country and the world. Down at the very bottom, though, you've got retail, medical. These sectors of the economy serve the local population more than anything else. Okay? So that's my paycheck comes to me, then I go to my doctor and take part of my paycheck to pay for my medical care. So no real money is being created, it's just being transferred from my bank account to his. That's different from a movie that generates ticket sales in Wisconsin, some part of which come back here to Los Angeles. So speaking of movies, let's see. Movie production continues to be very important. It's a little bit off the mark. Those two bars on the right side show year-to-date numbers for 2011 versus 2012. So we're down about 2%. Took a big hit during the recession, 2009, but seems to be coming back. And the employment numbers reflect that. Again, I'm not quite sure why is this a Mac?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe the Mac doesn't like my Microsoft-based, my PC-based PowerPoint. Anyway, so recession, we saw job losses, and then we've seen some growth. We're up 4.1% on a year-over-year basis. Trade and transportation, I alluded to before, also took a hit during the recession and has held steady since then. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm happy to take questions that you might have on specific sectors of the economy. So our trade, our port activity, which is measured by the number of containers that goes through, also took a hit in 2009. I know I'm repeating myself, but you can see that we've come back, and we expect to continue to recover as we go through the next couple of years. Because of the slowdown in the global and national economy, we're probably only going to see the number of TEUs, the number of 20-foot equivalent units, up by maybe 2% by the end of the year, which is well below what we forecast for this year. So the slowdown in the overall economy has definitely slowed down the pace of activity at the port. And of course, that creates a ripple effect for all of us here in Southern California. So we, again, saw a hit incurred on professional business services during the recession, but this sector and its component industries is coming back, so this is good. In terms of leisure and hospitality, we're seeing recovery in terms of hotel occupancy rates, average daily rates. All of these things have really come back from the worst, which occurred back a couple of years ago. So accordingly, employment's on the mend as well. Manufacturing, I already spoke a little bit about. We have a little bit more Durable goods manufacturing shown in blue compared to non-durable goods manufacturing. So what are we making here? We're making airplane parts, even if we're not manufacturing whole airplanes as much as we used to. It's space stuff. We're making foods, processed foods, garments, a whole bunch of stuff gets made on the non-durable side. But it's the non-durable side that's taking the biggest hit. It continues to lose jobs at a much faster pace overall than the durable goods side of things. Technology is really important, but it bridges both the manufacturing and the services side. Represents 180,000 jobs against a base of about 3.5 million jobs in LA County. So that's pretty significant. And you can see that with the exception of a couple of sectors, we're seeing gains or at least stability in these labor market numbers. So this, in part, is a reflection of the South Bay. But as I said before, the fiscal cliff has the potential to tip some of these numbers from being either slightly positive or positive to maybe being negative, depending on how things play out. So this is where we really have to be concerned about the local effect of some of these national policies. Aerospace manufacturing, down a little bit. We lose jobs and have been losing jobs. I was talking before we started the program with Jim and Jack about the fact that the way we do business, you and the way I do business, has changed so much because of technology. It's also affected the way airplanes get made and so on and so forth. So technology has certainly displaced workers, at least to some extent, if not to a large extent. Our office used to have like a secretary for every vice president and department manager. We have 2 secretaries now. Most of those jobs have been converted to some sort of a multi-function responsibility, more like a coordinator. Well, why is that? Well, you know, I'm one of the department heads. I answer my own phone, but very few people call me anymore because they're sending me emails, which I answer, and I do all of my correspondence mostly by email, right, on my own computer. So I don't have the same sort of need for an administrative assistant that my predecessors might have had. Well, that sort of changed. You don't think about it. That's happening before our very eyes, and that's one of the reasons why in manufacturing, as well as so many other industries, you're seeing a hit to employment, which is the red line. But the nice thing about this graph is that after taking a hit in 2009 during the recession, our manufacturing has come back and has actually exceeded the value prior to the recession. So this is a good thing. We get beat up, the U.S. beats itself up over our manufacturing sector, but the fact of the matter is we continue to be the dominant manufacturing economy in the world based on the dollar value of what we produce. And I talk about that because we're the manufacturing capital of the United States here in LA County. Okay, a little bit on housing. We've got the hit that the housing market took back in 2007, 2008. It's a far cry. That's 4 years ago, and people still are looking over their shoulders about, concerned about whether the housing market is in recovery. If you cannot convince your clients that at this stage the housing market's in recovery, then you need to go back and work on your game plan, because this year, you can certainly say this year's been the transition year. We've seen home prices firm up markedly. Along the coast here, most likely some pretty significant gains. It's hard to make comparisons against the peak. There's no doubt about that. So the person who's thinking about selling and remembers that, geez, my house that I bought for $250,000 20 years ago and was worth $1 million at peak is now only worth $675,000 or something like that. Okay, so you got to let that go and deal with the reality that's here. Those are paper.
That's the problem.
That's the problem. I certainly appreciate that, but you guys are salespeople. I'm just the economist. So there's a guy. You have the power of persuasion. So let's go out there and persuade, because the expectation is that things should get better next year. Prices are likely to go up. So for the would-be buyer, I know supply is constrained, but if they find a home that meets their needs now and financing is something that they can do, or if they have cash, all the better, then they should take advantage of the opportunity. Here you've got LA's I apologize, this is not CAR, but this is data quick information. But it shows that home prices through the year have risen. There's a very strong seasonal component to sales, right? So here we are at the beginning of 2012, and we've got a pretty good looking trajectory for home sale, for home prices represented by that black line in 2012. So I think we're going to continue to see that. Even with the fiscal cliff, I think you're going to be continuing to look at a pretty tight market in 2012, both on the distressed side, which maybe has less of a presence in the immediate coastal markets, maybe more so the further you go inland. But you're going to see continued tight supplies. You've got so many discretionary sellers who are still sitting on the fence. So the other challenge is to convince that person, as I guess I was just describing, that if you've been waiting for several years for that all clear signal, it's been sounding for a little while. Here are the very tight inventory conditions. Under 4 months with the exception of Ventura County, 3 months for Los Angeles County, about half what it was a year ago. I don't think that's any surprise to you. And that's MLS based. Permits are going to come back, but it's going to take some time. We're looking at a housing shortage in the second half of this decade. It's going to trigger increases in construction employment, and we'll probably get back to some long-term normal levels of building permits, not in the South Bay, right, but in the far reaches of the county. So that's good. That's good for the economy as a whole. But it's been a very slow turn for people on the new home side of things. As bad as it's been for those of us in the residential side, it's been even harder for these guys. I apologize for the cough. So this year, as you can see, the first yellow column shows what how we're wrapping things up with some growth in the labor market after some very weak years the last few years. And the unemployment rate finally comes down. Even next year, we're still looking at an unemployment rate that may, on average, be above that 10% threshold, with the magic number being 7.5%, don't forget. All these other indicators suggest that we'll continue to improve. So national, state, and local level improvement is certainly in the cards. But even with that improvement, we still have a ways to go. The green lines show non-farm jobs in LA County. And so you can look in the middle of the figure and see where we were at peak, over 4,100,000 jobs. Even next year, we still expect to see the job count fall short of 3.9 million. So we still have a long ways to go before we can say that the economy is fully recovered from the Great Recession. But having said that, the consumer sector is healing. This is personal income appearing in blue, and then growth in taxable sales. So consumers are increasingly opening their wallets and spending more. You probably heard about car sales. We're probably going to see some very good car sales this year. The average age of a car in American households is at an all-time high. And so people hung on to their cars during the recession longer than they normally would have. And so you're seeing a manifestation of that need to replace cars in the form of elevated car sales here as we close out 2012. These are the kinds of signs that you want to look for that indicate that the consumer sector is healing, and that's going to help us observe that the economy is going to move forward in 2013. Okay. So, boy, I know I covered a whole lot of stuff. The takeaway is that on all levels, national, state, and local, we're seeing improvement. Maybe not as fast as we would like to see, but it continues to accrue. With each of these past couple of years, we've looked back and said, gee, it didn't feel like anything happened, but in fact, we've seen progress made. I think you're going to feel in 2013 more like the recession is over. If I come back here next year, I expect to see more hands raised when I ask the question, do you think the recession is over? Because indeed, I think it'll probably hit each one of us materially in a much more profound way in 2013 than it has thus far. in these last couple of years. On
That's
that
your-
note, I'm going to say thank you. I wish you all a great holiday season, and I'm happy to take any questions that will be moderated by Jack.
There we go.
Clean up.
Number one, please thank Robert. Great presentation. Any questions that, okay, Diana?
What do you predict, or what does the city predict for the new football stadium as far as job growth? And conversely, companies like Northrop Grumman, I believe, took their headquarters back east. So was that because there was a better manufacturing facility, or are they leaving California due to taxes?
All right, so just to remind you, I'm not the city and I'm not the county. I'm a 501c3 chief economist. Okay. We do actually conduct impact analyses of various projects. Have not done one of the stadium. The upshot, I'll give you my personal view. I'm kind of skeptical of the overall benefit to the local economy of building a new stadium. I work downtown Los Angeles. It certainly has improved over the years, but it's had a lot of public money help, a lot of subsidies that kind of help promote development. It'll be neat to have a stadium adjacent to Staples Center, which is right there with the convention center. But our real struggle, at least to make it more of a destination, is the lack of hotel space in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles. That's going to improve some. There's going to be a new, the Grand Hotel at the corner of Grand and Wilshire, I think, is going to be replaced with a larger hotel. So to me, it's a mixed bag. It's not clear to me that the Farmers Field is going to generate a positive net benefit to the local community. It'd be cool to have a professional football team, but right now we've got UCLA. I'm sorry. We're happy to see UCLA succeed. And USC, you've got two great college football teams that sort of fill that void that was left when the Rams departed. And it's going to be hard to overcome that. Let's see, there was one other question. Oh, Northrop. So let me say quickly about Northrop and so many other companies that had strong ties to the defense sector, oftentimes, or have been moving their headquarters to the East Coast so that they can be closest to their most important customer. So the headquarters functions have left. Not a good thing for us. But a lot of their manufacturing design, one of the most important things that totally flies under the radar here is the research, development, and testing that takes place not too far from here. LA Air Force Base, the aerospace company, that's where the ideas first hit the drawing board and get designed out. So even before stuff gets produced, that might happen somewhere else. Some of that early stage research and development is happening right here. So we continue to be a hotbed for aerospace, even though the headquarters in many instances have moved away.
Okay, Getchell.
I have a client that mentioned something kind of interesting. She thinks that because the interest rates are so low, the people that are buying houses now will probably never sell them. Because their payments will be so low in the future, they'll never be able to. The amount of additional payment will not equal the amount of appreciation. So they'll be more likely to add on.
Well, my first observation is to just remind us all that you can have an active market and at an 8% interest rate. So you're right, there are some households that might buy now or refinance now, hunker down, they're there for the duration. There's just no changing them, or they, as you say, they may do some improvements. I certainly expect that is going to be a part of the landscape going forward. But that's kind of a static view of things. The next thing we want to recognize is that households change as they go through their life cycle, right? So you've got a household that starts off with 2 adults, then you add kids, maybe you need to go to a bigger home, and then as you get older you need to move, you need to downsize. So those kinds of life cycle situations or changes in the life cycle of a family will continue to drive the dynamics of the market. And the other thing to keep in mind, of course, and this is a troublesome thing actually for me, is that with growth in incomes over time, you're going to be able to enable households to be mobile, and even though rates might be low and their monthly payment might be extremely low because of the 3% mortgage rate that they got right now, they may still have the wherewithal and to follow up on what is a demand or a need to make that move. So a lot of things have to fall into place for those people to make the move, but that's the more dynamic view of things than to just say, well, they're going to hunker down and stay for the duration. And the reason I'm concerned about income is things like losing high-paying jobs because of defense cuts and things like that. That's a real problem that we have here in Los Angeles County, and it certainly concerns me for the South Bay area.
Okay, John, did you have a? No, okay.
I've been
Susan.
looking at Tim on Getchell's. It seems like there's a lot of private equity firms and hedge funds that are taking millions of dollars and beating out a lot of lower income homeowners who want the private ownership to live, and they're going to keep those long term as rental property. So how do you have any forecasting or numbers relative to that? Because that to me seems troublesome, because then we have Wall Street owning the properties, we don't have people owning them.
And
Most of those hedge funds only have a time horizon of 7 to 10 years.
Oh, they have to turn it?
You know, what I was going to say was that that may be a contributing factor to the low inventory that we have at the present time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just looking at how that might be affecting the current situation. But you're right. It's interesting. Do any of you know a guy named Bruce Norris or hear of him? If you have pay any attention to the Inland Empire, this is the big hard money guy who goes and buys up tons of houses and all that. And he said the East Coast hedge fund guys came like 2 years too late to get any really good values, but they're here and they are buying, and because they want to get a piece of the action. So I think your point is well taken. They are going to freeze up, if you will, some part of the housing stock that might otherwise turn. This is just one of those aspects of the market that we kind of have to work through.
Okay. Go ahead.
What's the likelihood, in your opinion, if you track it, of an LA County bankruptcy, and how would that impact, in general, the housing market?
I think I'm more concerned about a bankruptcy on the part of the city of Los Angeles than the county of Los Angeles.
So, yeah.
The county of Los Angeles actually, its fiscal situation is in pretty good shape, and has been even through the recession, or was through the recession, I should speak in past tense. The city of Los Angeles is in a more precarious position. I'm not really a government finance guy, so I'm probably not in the right position to address it with any specifics, but I would just say that it's the city we're more concerned about than the county.
Okay, David?
There's a question about the field, but more locally, and Jack and Jim may know more. But Playa Vista just got sold, and I do construction there as well. How much do you think that would affect this market in terms of housing? There's also the retail there, and people seem pretty optimistic in terms of the folks I speak with, but as an economist, do you see that as a viable push for construction jobs in the next 5 years? I mean, is that a realistic assumption? Are you seeing that?
Sure. Let me just mention as an aside, I had the pleasure of going to the new YouTube LA space, which is, they converted an old hangar down over at Playa Vista to the YouTube. They produce YouTube videos there, among other things. It is really cool if you can ever get a tour of that place. So the thing about LA County and construction is that when you start looking at the areas that, such as Playa Vista, these are sort of infill areas that are going to help with construction jobs and so on. But I don't think they're going to make huge, it's not going to show up on the radar screen in terms of the overall construction numbers, not in a big way, the overall construction numbers for LA County. So certainly that'll help the coast tends to be constrained, certainly along on either side of LAX. It's constrained in terms of housing units. You've got people who are willing to live in higher density developments, whether it's a single family or a condo or townhome or some sort of a multi-unit structure. So I think you're going to find that the demand is there. They're going to be able to, parse things out, continue to develop. There also continues to be a demand for commercial space. So the term Silicon Beach is increasingly used to refer to the arrival of tech companies here in Southern California. I was at an entertainment industry conference about a month ago. We released a report on the entertainment industry here in Southern California. And the most interesting thing is that the guys from Silicon Valley say, we need to be here because we may have the distribution channels, but you guys have the content. So I think the trend that we're going to expect is that more and more the guys from the, not dot-coms, that's so 20th century. The guys from the Silicon Valley are going to set up shop down here, mostly in the attractive beach-adjacent areas, and so that's probably going to lead to heightened demand in the west side, heightened demand for commercial space, industrial space, or industrial-type space, because they're going to need some facilities like sound stages and so on. So that should help some.
Okay, last question. Go ahead. Back there.
Yes.
I was wondering about your just your concern with some of your peers' predictions on the massive insertions of cash from the Fed, if that will develop into large inflation in the next 10 years, and how that will affect especially California.
It's a great question. One of the things that we always need to be aware of is the potential for Fed action to the potential on the one hand for our fiscal policy to be inflationary, and then monetary policy, which is what the Fed handles, for their actions to be inflationary. So what the Fed has done over these past few years is not just keep interest rates down, but they've employed a number of heretofore unused policy tools to be able to keep interest rates down, especially low interest rates. Up to this point, they've been engaged in what are called balance sheet actions. So they've been taking short-term securities, selling those on the market to get cash to buy long-term securities, stuff like that. So they actually haven't been creating money in the sense that a lot of pundits happen to characterize it. They're not creating money out of thin air. They're actually swapping stuff on their balance sheet. They have been putting a ton of liquidity into the financial markets. How much of it have we as consumers and businesses seen? Very little. So it's one thing to flood the financial institutions with liquidity. It's another thing to see that liquidity freed up and enter the rest of the economy. With high credit standards, restrictions, and so on, that still hasn't happened. Lending institutions are still kind of gun shy. When they start to get greedy and they see the economy pick up, they're going to look at that huge pile of cash that they have that they haven't been lending. They're going to start to lend more, and then the Fed's going to have to kick it into gear to prevent what you're alluding to, which is the potential for much higher inflation. So the Fed has the ability to undo what it has done, but I would just add the cautionary asterisk that the Fed typically is a reactive organization. So when it finally does kick it into gear, we'll have already begun to see that sort of process take place. So it's going to be behind the curve in reacting. It has the potential to undo what it has done. It's trying very hard to keep the economy going. The Fed's got these two objectives. I'm sorry to go on for so long. The Fed has these two objectives. It's supposed to get the economy to full employment and keep inflation low. And right now, because inflation's so low, they don't have to worry so much about it. So they're putting every effort they can into bringing the unemployment rate down. They're really perplexed, for lack of a better word, that the fiscal policy side on the part of the Congress is essentially frozen, places paralyzed, and they're not doing their part. So the Fed, meanwhile, has this, it's the Humphrey-Hawkins Act that requires them to try to get us to full employment. So they're trying to do everything they can. And some of these things can potentially be dangerously inflationary in the long run, but they theoretically, they have the capacity to undo this. So we definitely need to be mindful of that inflation threat. I think that we're at least a couple years away from likely seeing that emerge as a concern that the Fed then has to balance between alongside its desire to get the labor market back to normal. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we've got to keep our eye on that.
Okay, thank you, Robert. We appreciate it very much. Okay, thank you very much for attending. We'll be bringing this again. We'll have him back this next year, and we look forward to having him then. Thank you again for attending.
Next time I come back,